And thank you to all of you that are here. Where's my Minnesotans? They're on table 18. Is that yes? I especially appreciated the text while I was still in bed this morning. That was nice. We're at table 18. Where are you? So that was pretty good. I want to thank Liz for her leadership, all of the leaders that are here today. How important this group is, the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. I don't think you have ever been more important. I think you know that there are changes that have taken place. That's a euphemism. That's how we say it in Minnesota. In the last year, among other things, I was officially displaced on the inaugural stage as the most famous Slovenian American by Melania Trump. That hurt. It was kind of a shock. She was actually born an hour away from where my relatives are from in Slovenia. And as I said at the National Prayer Breakfast, every time I look at her in the mirror, it's like looking in the mirror. Why you are so important, I think you know. This is a time like no other when it comes to international affairs. A different approach has been taken by this administration. I did support a number of the people who are in the cabinet. I think there's some good people in the cabinet, some people I don't quite agree with, and then some good people in the cabinet, because I truly believe we need to move forward as a country, no matter who's in charge, that we can't just sit things out on the global stage for 4 years. I'm someone that likes to work across the aisle. I note that one of my former colleagues, Senator Norm Coleman, is chair of the Minnesota Advisory Committee. I think that's a great thing. And I'm always trying to find common ground. I actually spent the last week of last year in Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltics with John McCain and Lindsey Graham. I was there on the front line, the eastern Ukraine, with the troops and President Poroshenko, and most importantly, with John McCain and Lindsey Graham on New Year's Eve. Which one do you kiss, right? It was hard. It was hard. Just one little sideline, and then I'll move on to the substance of my speech. On that trip with the snow coming at us, it was a dark, dark night. Poroshenko wanted to show American support for NATO and for Eastern Europe and for standing up for the Baltics and for Ukraine. And he put us on live TV and presented John McCain with a machine gun and presented Lindsey Graham with a pistol and gave me 2 daggers. That is a true story. So, when you are making your pitches on the Hill that I just learned about as I came in, what do I think some of the things that are important to talk about? The first, when you talk to members, especially some of our more moderate Democrats, Republicans, I think there is a very strong case to be made for this foreign affairs budget when it comes to economics. I'm from a state that has 18 Fortune 500 companies. We understand that if you shut off engagement with the rest of the world, that isn't just bad for diplomacy, it's bad for the economy. I personally was not a fan of getting out of the International Climate Agreement. By the way, that may not be your #1 pitch with some of my colleagues that you're going to go see. I'm not suggesting that, but for me and a number of Democrats, it transformed what might be meetings for our diplomats in other countries where the first thing discussed might have been, well, this is what we're doing on the climate change agreement, yay, yay, to why aren't you part of this climate change agreement? And it's going to allow China, of course, to come in and say, hey, we want to work with you on meeting these goals and come buy our solar panels. So I think that piece of it has been a step back, but I still think one of the best arguments is economic. And it also, by the way, if you ever go into the issue of immigration reform, also merges into that. When you look at our country and our companies and how our businesses work, we now have 70 Fortune 500 companies that are headed up by immigrants. 25% of our U.S. Nobel laureates were born in other countries. And we are living at a time where the Wild hockey team in Minnesota, they got in the playoffs this year, well, they can get unlimited visas for their players from, do you guys know what country? Minnesota, Canada, that is correct. They get unlimited visas really from anywhere, but they're almost all from Canada. few here and there from Slovenia. Okay, they get unlimited visas, but if the Mayo Clinic wants to bring in the spouse of a doctor, or 3M in Minnesota wants to bring in an engineer, that's a lot harder to do. And so for me, it's this issue of not just doing business around the world and seeing this as part of our economic future, but it's also bringing in talent from around the world and continuing to refresh our entrepreneurship with new ideas and new connections to the rest of the world. Now, there are a lot of Republican senators that actually did favor immigration reform. It's easy to find out who, but we worked on that deal that we got out of the Senate. I'm on the Judiciary Committee, and we worked on that deal for a very long time, and we're pretty proud of it. Another issue that means a lot to me and where we have some Republican support is the issue of Cuba. And we're going to hear some news on Cuba from the president on Friday. We don't know exactly what it's going to be. I lead the bill to lift the embargo. I look at this as 11 million people, 90 miles off our shores, and a failed policy for 50-some years is not a reason to continue it. It's a reason to change it. I see some of our Minnesota ag people out there, and they know the potential. We already do millions of dollars in humanitarian aid when it comes to ag with Cuba, and if we opened up the market, we would be able to do a lot more for American businesses. Probably my best moment of going to Cuba over the last year was the trip. I got to go with the president, but the trip with John Kerry, where we had these 3 Marines. I think their names were something like Jim, Mike, and Larry, and they had been the Marines that were stationed in Cuba when we closed down the embassy. And they walked out to take our flag down to these jeering crowds of Cubans. And one of them looked at the crowd and said, "We will be back." And 50-some years later, those 3 Marines came back with that flag and handed it to 3 young Marines who hoisted it over our embassy when we opened up the doors. And so for me, it was a reminder again that change takes a long time. It isn't easy as you go around to the Hill today and you think about that kind of motivation, but it does happen. And it's certainly there for the taking when it comes to some of these economic issues. Another part of the world that my colleagues care a lot about, I'm involved in the prayer breakfast. That was my reference to the Melania Trump joke actually was from the last National Prayer Breakfast where I was on the stage with the president. And a lot of my colleagues are really involved in that, from Senator Inhofe to Senator Enzi and others. And they care a lot about foreign aid because of the work that they have done all around the world. And I think that's an important thing to remember when you go into certain members' offices. They have been to these countries, they've seen the poverty, they've seen the difference. They also have seen some of the changes that we've made to USAID under Raj Shah's leadership and others, where we've reached out to the business community and the faith community in a different way. I got to go on the first all-women senators trip to Africa. Our focus was agriculture and being able to visit a woman in a little hut. She was a widow. She had 2 kids. She had just a small plot of land where she was growing teff, and to stand in her hut that had no electricity but had a solar panel that she had gotten because she was one of the people that was leading an effort in her community to bring better health care. And on that hut, there was only one thing on the wall, and it was a organization chart from the Gates Foundation. And it showed her hut in the middle with the star and all these other huts around it that had little pictures of babies and other things. And it was her job to make sure that people were getting their baby care, that they were using good hygiene. And she had a little star she put on it. And we asked her, well, what is your life like? You have to walk an hour and a half each way every day to get water, all these things that were happening. You're a widow, you have this, you have this. And then we said, you must have challenges in a very American senator way. What is your biggest challenge? We asked. And she said, I have no challenges. She pointed at the chart. I am a leader. So when you think about foreign aid and the work that we do with our partners all around the world, to me, that's the answer. It's empowering people to be leaders, empowering people to change their lives. It was Bill Clinton who once told the story that after our country through foreign aid had helped a factory and had helped build a factory in a village, and all the people got jobs, and he brought back a shirt from that factory, and he put it in the front of his closet, and every time he looked at it, he would look at it and he'd think, they don't hate us. They don't hate us. I think it was General Mattis that said if you cut the foreign affairs budget to the extent that they're talking about, well, they just have to make it up in bullets, and that's not what we want. We know the importance of diplomacy. We know the importance of foreign aid and how it has worked for our country. I think the second argument that is really powerful, besides this economic, faith-based argument of working with the rest of the world, is that security argument. You know that there were over 100 military leaders who signed a letter recently opposing the cuts to the foreign aid to the State Department. And that was actually when Carl referenced the event I did with Congressman Emmer, who, by the way, is a pretty conservative congressman. He took Michelle Bachmann's seat. Does that give you a sense? Okay. He took Michelle Bachmann's seat, and he and I did an event together about a month ago at the Refugee Committee in Minnesota, surrounded by advocates for refugees and advocates for Somalia. As you maybe know, Minnesota has the biggest Somalian population in the country, and we are very proud of that population. A number of the people live in Congressman Emmer's district, and there is a major drought going on in Somalia. And so when he and I did the event, I talked about the humanitarian issues and the refugee order, and Franken and I bringing in a 4-year-old from a Ugandan refugee camp. But his focus was on security and the way that if we do not help Somalia right now with this drought, and we have al-Shabaab still brewing and still causing problems out there, if we don't do something more with our budget with foreign aid, then we're just going to be creating more problems for us around the world. And if there's one thing I've learned as a senator, these problems, even if you want to keep your head in the sand, these problems don't stay away. Whether it's a soccer dad calling me because there's a mudslide in Guatemala and their kids are over there, or it is an iron range worker out of work up in northern Minnesota concerned about steel dumping, or whether it is, as we maybe remember this incident, the mom of a hiker who was somehow managed to hike into Iran and then ended up in prison for a year. Members of Congress deal with the rest of the world. It doesn't stay away from you. So this idea of focusing on economics and focusing on security, as well as with some members, their faith-based involvement in international affairs, I think, is really important. I wouldn't neglect bringing up this climate change agreement with certain people that you meet with. You'll know what their interests are and whether or not it's a major focus. But as you know, 195 countries made a pledge to work together to combat climate change. We have now 2 other nations that we joined that are not a part of that agreement, Nicaragua and Syria. For me, this is an economic loss more than anything. When I look at my state, we don't have coal that we produce in our state. We don't produce oil. We tend to produce a lot of wind. Like many of our states in the country, we call ourselves the Saudi Arabia of wind, but there's about 15 that do that, so it's kind of funny. We produce some solar panels, and we have a very, I'd say, a strong renewable electricity standard that was signed into law by Governor Pawlenty, and it was bipartisan in our state, and it has served us well. So I don't want to lose that kind of leadership. So mostly I want to thank you for being willing to come out and advocate for our country and the importance of globalism and the importance of seeing America as part of the rest of the world. I don't think we should just be tolerating internationalism. I think we should be embracing it. It is the future. Our allies are our friends, and we have to remember that as we go down this path. And I think you will find surprising interest in internationalism and with a lot of the members, but a lot of them or their staffs. People can get very scared of talking about this in public, and I'm blessed with a state that seems to have some understanding that we're not isolated. Maybe it's because we can see Canada from our porch, and maybe it's our strong business community and the way we've been able to work together. But I really strongly believe you can make the case to anyone, and that's your job today. So please keep your optimism high. I always try to do that no matter how bad things are. I actually have the desk that Hubert Humphrey once had, and he was known as the happy warrior. A little side note for how you just have to wait for good things to happen in Washington. I asked for that desk when I first got to the Senate, and I was so excited. All the desks look alike, and you open them up, and then you see they carved their names in it. So the desk arrived, and I opened it up, and the name carved into the desk, along with many others, was Gordon Humphrey, a little-known senator from New Hampshire. Well, thank you, New Hampshire. They had kind of made an error and accidentally gave me Gordon Humphrey's desk instead of Hubert Humphrey's desk. By that point, I had already learned you pick your battles, so I waited, and about 2 years later, I'm sitting with Jean Shaheen, who was then the new senator from New Hampshire, and I told her the story, and she said, well, how do you know that it was Gordon Humphrey's desk? I said, because they carved their names in, it's really cool. And I opened it up to show her, and what I didn't know was that in the new Congress coming in, they had actually given me Hubert Humphrey's desk. So that is the desk I proudly have now. So go forward, be those happy warriors, and get this done for us. Thank you.